I'm Becca. Welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be starting a series on the basics of historical dress, starting from the base layers like the shift, the stays, and the pockets, and moving outwards towards the gowns and skirts. For the first video in the series, I'm going to be showing you how I made the first layer of historical undergarments called the shift. The shift was the innermost layer worn against the skin to keep the dirt, oil, and sweat from the body from touching the outer garments. Obviously, pre-washing machine, the outer garments couldn't be washed very frequently. Neither could the people.
Crazy world, a lot of smells.
But it was common for most people, even the poorer people, to have multiple shifts, so they could change them out more often to keep everything clean. The basic construction and shapes used to make a shift stayed relatively the same throughout the centuries. However, as the gown's sleeves and necklines changed, so would the shifts. By the way, for this series, I'm going to be staying mostly within the later half of the 18th century. So during the early 18th century, the necklines were a long oval shape. The sleeves were also very long and very wide. Closer to the mid-18th century, the necklines were still round but not as long. The sleeves also stayed pretty much the same, probably twice as wide as they were long. Moving into the late 18th century, the necklines become much more squared and horizontal. The sleeves also become much narrower and shorter. So shifts were actually pretty easy to make since they were just constructed from various size rectangles. They were made from 4 basic pieces. First, there was the body, which was the biggest rectangle. Next, there was the gores, which were long triangles. Next, there were the sleeves, which were smaller rectangles. And finally, there were the gussets, which were just small squares. So the gores would be attached to the side of the shift to make the skirt wider, and the gussets would be attached to the underarms to make arm movement easier. To start making your shift, you'll need to draft your pattern, and to start, you'll have to take your measurements. So I'll be working from this pattern, which I'll link. It's pretty easy to use since all you need to do is fill out your measurements. So you can see on the left there's already a sketch that shows where you need to mark everything on the fabric, but I decided to make my own sketch to reference since I added a few ruffles and made some changes. So now I'm going to do a quick run through of the materials you'll need. Historically, shifts would be made from a fine white linen, but of course nowadays that can get pretty expensive, so I just bought 3 yards of a linen rayon blend. I also used linen thread, cotton twill tape, beeswax for conditioning the thread, which I'll explain more about later, thread for basting or gathering, red embroidery thread for cross stitching, a seam ripper for when I inevitably make mistakes, something to measure with, and an awl for the buttonholes. Next, I'm going to prepare my fabric by pulling a thread and cutting along the gap that it leaves behind. This makes the edges of your fabric nice and straight. Sometimes the thread can snap as you're pulling it and you'll need to find it again, and this can make the process a bit annoying. But I do think it's worth it in the end because it makes everything a lot easier to line up when you need to fold and cut it. And here's what it should look like once you've transferred your markings to the fabric. Before I marked everything, I first folded the fabric in half lengthwise, then widthwise, I don't know if that's a word, but the first thing you're going to cut out are the gores from the side of the body. Next, you need to cut the top of the gores in half where they were folded so that you have 4 triangles in total. And to make sure all my edges are straight, whenever I'm cutting, I do the same thread pulling technique. Now you just want to make sure that you have all of the markings on both sides of the fabric. And lastly, I just need to cut out all of the smaller rectangles for the sleeves, cuffs, ruffles, and gussets. Also, I know I haven't even started sewing yet, but I've already made a pretty big mistake, which of course I'll point out and show how I fixed later. So I cut out the neck hole off camera, but we can finally start the actual sewing of the shift. You'll want to begin by hemming or at least basting the neck first, otherwise it'll stretch out as you're working. And I decided to first baste mine before taking a brief intermission to fix your boy's first mistake. So you might have already noticed that the width of my shift is looking, well, wide. That would be because I miscalculated how wide it actually needed to be, resulting in it being the size of a literal tent. So to fix my mistake, I basically had to remark the side where my correct measurement was and cut it out again. I also had to fix the size of the gores later on too. So moving back to hemming the neck, after I thread my needle, I condition my thread by running it through a block of beeswax. Doing this can help strengthen the linen fibers in the thread and keeps it from tangling and fraying. I'm going to be using the felling stitch to hem the neck, and I'll link a video that helped me learn how to do it, but basically, I just grabbed 3 to 4 threads on the bottom piece of fabric, pulled the needle up, and then grabbed 1 to 2 threads on the fold of the hem, and then pulled it through. I also thought I'd mention that as I was editing this, my laptop decided now would be a good time to update, and that deleted a lot of my footage, which was extremely frustrating. So unfortunately, this video can't go into too much detail and might skip a few steps, so I'll link some of the tutorials that really helped me along the way. So moving on to the sleeves, I prepared the cuffs by creasing my seam allowance, which is 1/4 inch lengthwise and 1/2 inch on the sides. I also hemmed about 3 inches up the sides of the sleeves before gathering the edge. Sadly, that would be one of the clips that got deleted. But after that, I do 2 rows of small running stitches for the gathers. And it's important that you get them as parallel as you possibly can, but just try your best, I guess. Next, I crease the edge of the sleeve and the cuff into 4 equal parts by folding it in half and then folding each of those halves in half. I don't know if that makes sense. But I do this so that I can line up the cuff creases and the sleeve creases and pin them together so that when I pull the threads, the gathers are equally spaced. And as I already kind of explained, I just pin the middle creases, the edges, and each of the other corresponding creases together. And then to make the gathers, you just pull on either side of the threads, and you can just adjust it until you like how they look. Now to sew the cuff to the sleeve, you slip stitch each individual gather to the edge of the cuff. Unfortunately, I also lost footage of sewing the other side of the cuff, but it's basically the same process of slip stitching each gather to the other side of the cuff. I also did a ladder stitch to close the side of the cuff, and you can't really see what I'm doing in this clip, but whatever. Next, for the ruffles I added to the edge of the sleeve, I started by hemming all the way around each piece with a rolled hem stitch. I'll link a helpful tutorial on how to do it. To attach the ruffles, it's pretty much the same process of doing 2 rows of parallel gathering stitches, creasing into 4 parts, pinning to the cuff, and slip stitching each gather to the top edge of the cuff. Now in this clip I had done the slip stitches on the wrong side of the cuff, but I found out it lays much flatter and looks way better if you slip stitch the gathers on the right side. Next, before doing the buttonholes, which I also lost the clips of, I reinforce the edges of the cuffs. I do this so that the fabric layers don't move and to strengthen them a bit. To do this, I sew very tiny lines of back stitches, and I mean very tiny, about 1/8 of an inch away from both edges of the cuff. It does take quite a while to do this, but I think it turns out pretty nicely. After finishing both sides, I sew the buttonholes. Next up, I attach the gusset to the top corner of one of my sleeves. I slightly offset the edges by about 1/4 of an inch to make filling the seams easier. To attach it, I do back stitches until 1 inch away from the end of the gusset. To attach the other side, I fold the gusset diagonally and flip it under. Then I fold the sleeve so that the pieces are right sides together, and repeat the same steps I did for the first side. Hopefully that made sense. Now here's where it gets a bit more confusing since I don't have a lot of the footage of me doing the seams. So before I felled the gussets, I first sewed from the bottom of the sleeve up to where the seams of the gussets meet. Then I felled all of the sleeve seams. The last step for the sleeves is to attach them to the body, and it's actually pretty similar to doing the cuffs and ruffles. You start by doing 2 parallel rows of gathering stitches from one gusset edge to the other, crease the middle of the shoulder and the center of the sleeve, pin them together, right sides together, pull the gathering threads, and then you backstitch each gather to the shoulder. Now I'm just fixing my second mistake, which was sewing together the comically large gores that I forgot to cut in half. I cut it so that the bottom of the gores would be 7 inches across instead of 14 inches. I only noticed something was off once I attached one of these giant gores to the side of my shift, and it looked ridiculous. This next step is absolutely vital to the success of your shift, so please pay very close attention. I won't be able to explain, so you'll just have to watch very closely. Alright, hope you guys got that. Next up is to sew the gores together, and you might notice there's a straight edge and a diagonal edge. You're going to want to sew on the diagonal side and then fell that seam down. Sadly, I lost all the clips of me attaching the gores and sewing the side of the shift, but basically after I sewed one of the sides of the gores to the shift, I then sewed the second side and went all the way up the shift until I reached the gussets. And finally, I felled all of the seams. So here I'm finishing the shoulder seams by stitching twill tape over the seams. I did this instead of felling so it wouldn't be as bulky. The final step, after hemming the bottom of course, which takes forever, is to cross stitch your initials to the center front of your shift. Historically, this wasn't really done as an embellishment, but was to keep track of whose shift was whose. Since they all looked very similar, it was a useful way to keep track of yours. I followed the instructions on SharonBernstein.com, which were very helpful, so I'll link it. It does take a while because you need to cross stitch going 2 threads across and 2 threads up and down. It also kind of strains your eyes if you're counting each of the threads like I did. And that's it, we're finally done. Now on to some weird clips of me wearing my shift over my clothes, because if I wasn't, that'd be nasty.